Hello and welcome back to my floor/living room. If you hear any pitter patters or meows, we have a cat. Yeah. What? Sorry, he's stinky. But yeah, today, I'm trying to figure out how to not necessarily introduce it in a positive light, but what I wanted to talk about today, or discuss, or just showcase in general, is about not necessarily, okay, so I want to talk about cults and cult leaders, but not necessarily cult leaders enigmatic present, but more so the vulnerability of the cult followers, people who were targeted or whatever. And then a little bit of information that I found out while doing a little bit of research. I actually did research for this video, so that's pretty sick and pretty actually smart of me to do. But yeah, so the first things that I want to talk about is this is inspired by, because John and I have actually been watching not necessarily true crime things, but I like watching documentaries. I like learning about things, even if it's just watching it and hearing the people's experiences from it. We started watching this 10-part documentary series on Wild Wild Country, which was the Wild Wild Country cult was basically the following of Osho, and he was basically a kind of Indian spiritualist who basically in terms of cult leaders, he was very modern and hip, and so I guess that's why he had a humongous following, because within what we learned from the introduction of the documentary is basically that was the largest immigration fraud, poisoning, 50,000 people were poisoned or something like that, involved on his commune that him and his secretary built in Oregon, I believe. Yeah, 50,000 people commune. It's basically their own little town, neighborhood, city, or whatever. But that's what inspired this video. And I wanted to talk about some parts. I kind of want to have 3 parts that I want to talk about. The first thing that I do want to talk about is basically I have my notes right here. She wrote notes. I wanted to type them, but I was I'm too lazy to type because my computer's really slow. I need a new one. So yeah, the characteristics of leaders, and I'll link all the articles that I find in the description. But what I've noticed, and then from what I read an article about, is basically that they are charismatic, they're motivating, / nurturing, and they're inspiring, and they're also very idealized. So, well, I'll talk more about this later. But if you're someone who's kind of lost, you're young, you've had a crisis, or two of the people that were interviewed in the Wild Wild Country documentary, one of them was a big shot lawyer in LA, and the other one was a Australian divorcee. And so they already have a lot of chaotic things going on in their life, and so they wanted to start new. They wanted to start fresh, and so you can see how this is the beginning of basically seeing how this person's teachings, lectures, speechings, and what they've heard from the people, and how they observe the following, how everybody is just calm and collected, and they all are in unison, and they're all bonding, and that they are, what they're viewing it from the outside is very idealized and very peaceful, because their life or their personal life is very complicated and chaotic and negative, and so they want to try something new, try something positive, try something more enlightening, and so that's kind of where it begins to, that's kind of where in their head the idea is planted that, hey, if you're with us, if you come with us, if you be with us, if you show us our teachings, you're going to be enlightened, you're going to have a better life, you're going to have a more positive, idealized out view, and you're going to be living what we're preaching. That's kind of the beginning and the aspect of it. They already planted that scene, and now it's just okay, now we can convince them, now we can get them here, now we can funnel all their money, all these other negative things that happen during these cult situations. Another thing that I didn't really know about, but I guess it kind of makes sense in the grander scheme of because there were sorry, my mind is going a mile a minute. During the time period, which I'm going to say is 60s, 70s, 80s, and probably late, early 90s, that was what do you want? I'm trying to talk. That was kind of the inspiration, kind of prime time for cults, cult followers, cult leaders, cult situations, things like that, because those are the same time frame where Jonestown happened, the Child of God cults, and then I found another one, the Branch Davidians. All of them were around that time period. Obviously, cults have been integrated in American history for a long time, but these are the ones that were more popularized. They caught media of it. They were able to interview survivors of it. They were able to witness these massacres, and these they basically had a lot more archival physical data from these cults than what was previously found back in the day, with the Salem witches and other things like that back in the day. there was these people called deprogrammers, and I'll link the TED Talk video that I found. That basically these people were called deprogrammers, and they were volunteers, and they had the ability to like infiltrate the cult. They removed because most of these people, the family of the loved one that was within the cult, they would have a conversation with the deprogrammer, with the volunteer, and tell them like, hey, like they've been missing for X amount of time, we just want them back in our life. So what the deprogrammer would do was they would infiltrate the cult, and they would remove the person and basically like kidnap them, but they're basically like retrieving the loved one and putting them in a safe spot so that the family can like get them back, basically. That's what deprogrammers did. And I thought that was also very fascinating because the lady whose TED Talk, I think her name is Diane Benscotter, actually was a deprogrammer for a while, but then because of, I guess, like the cult's power or whatever, she was actually jailed and arrested for, I guess, like a certain amount of count of kidnappings and those, and she stopped deprogramming. But prior to her being a deprogrammer, she was actually in the Mooney cult. I don't know what that is, or I didn't do research about that one, but that was also a popular one during that time. And so I thought that was pretty wild and pretty crazy. And then the wrapping up piece that I want to talk about with this is the followers / culty followers vulnerability that they had and at the time, because I talked to John about this last night, and basically how like a lot of these people, they're young, they're middle aged, they are kind of in a crisis in their life, they have gone through a lot of negative things, they want to be spiritualized, they want to be enlightened, they're basically looking for any excuse to run away from their current life. Not necessarily like, not all of these people were running away, some of them willingly volunteered, some of them were kind of pushed into it, some of them were manipulated, some of them were violated, they were, however the means that the cult acquired them, everything under the sun probably happened within the cult growing, and amassing. So, but what I want to talk about is specifically like with those two stories of the divorcee and the attorney, is that they were at a low point in their life, low point. And so a lot of these, what these cult leaders did, like when you went to their teachings or talking, so like even when you heard from like word of mouth or like just people talking about it in general, but specifically with the guy, his name was Osho Bhagwani, whatever. You were able to like see his lectures and his talks or whatever, and he was very enigmatic. He was very like powerful. He seemed kind of like, from the words of his secretary Sheila, he was basically like a second Buddha. So he was kind of like already like, they were already talking about him as if he were already a god, And so I'm not necessarily sure what the perspective was, because people who were in Jonestown, all the people were massacred. I don't know people who ran away or whatever. I didn't necessarily research on that, so I'm not 100% sure. I don't know if there are survivors or like testimonials of it, but I know there's archival data of like people speaking about it, but not from first-hand experience, from second-hand, third-hand, people who were moving the bodies and things like that. But I know with this specific wild country, with what was going on in there, they were idolizing man. They were just like, okay, he has all the answers. And the people that they were witnessing, like I remember one of the quotes that the attorney gave is basically he felt that everything was very chaotic in his life, and so he wanted to move away from the hustle and bustle of like the busy life. And so when he arrived to so he had like multiple locations, the cult leader, when he arrived to his first one in India, he said that as soon as he got there, it was like a breath of fresh air. It was very peaceful. He literally said, it felt like I was home. And so that's already like, they're already vulnerable. And so like them going there and being with the people and the cult leader, it's all like mind-boggling. It's all like a wash of relief, because I believe if you are a followee, like if I were there at this time, you wouldn't even have to think about anything, like, okay, like this person's gonna provide for me, they're gonna they're gonna provide for me, they're gonna clothe me, they're gonna feed me, I'm gonna be enlightened spiritually. It's basically gonna be like my own heaven on earth. And the reason why I think why so many people were amassed and so many people were intrigued and fascinated and in love with these leaders and these cults and the people who were in the cult is that they kind of are going through a process, because the video that I was looking, it's basically how like cults rewire your brain. And so when I was thinking about this and like just in general, like if putting myself in their shoes, basically, you are basically lost, you want to be a part of something. We all have that innate human need to feel wanted, to want to belong to something bigger than what we think we are. So that's why like religion is very popular. People like, there's very little difference between cults and like religious followings, and like it's not controversial. I don't believe it's controversial because you're going to a place of worship every week, every day. It's becoming a part of your life. Obviously you're not like living, unless you're like a priest, a nun, among those things, you're not living in the church, but it's a part of your life. It's a part of your beliefs, and that you would do every day, like you pray every day. But these people took it to another level, and where they're like are living with each other, they're having sex with each other, they're being with each other every waking moment. And so like it was literally their lifestyle. It's all that they knew now, because they weren't necessarily brainwashed, but their brain was rewired to believe, like by an emotional sensory overload, like I wrote that like they don't have to worry about like the real world anymore. They don't have to worry about any of that anymore, because they were all like frustrated with their previous livings prior to being with the cult. And so that's what I thought was very, very interesting and very like mind-blowing, because they're all young, middle-aged, they want to change in life, they want to feel a higher sense of spirituality. And so like even within that's also the first steps to them being like manipulated and assaulted and abused more later on. And then another thing that I also like, I think it was like a key point, in that they were lowering their defenses, because they wanted to be loved, they wanted to be needed, they wanted to feel like a part of a community. And so they lowered their defenses because they wanted that need to belong, they wanted to be loved by something greater than themselves. And then I think so the third article, I think it's from The Verge, basically said, I think this is a really, really good quote, especially to end off the video, because I've been talking for some amount of time, and I'm kind of thirsty, that they are in a state of psychological instability, basically meaning that like not that they're feeble-minded or weak-minded, but that at the time of them being manipulated, and at the time of them being introduced to the cult and feeling that sense of relief washing over them, it's basically them pulling down their defenses, pulling down like that logic sensor, like, oh, like that red flag, that like, hey, this is a bad thing. But instead they're choosing to be like, oh no, this is a good thing, it's going to be good for me, So it's also just like they're targeting the people who are just trying to find an answer and trying to find a better life, but in the end, ultimately being manipulated. And especially with the Wild Country cult, what had happened is that they like the Bhagwan, the Osho, he literally was like forcing sterilization on these people. They were having to force to be abortions, and a lot of these people, they were doctors, lawyers, they were engineers, they had money. He was literally taking control of their assets and all their money and funneling it into the commune, and it's like not cool. And so it's just like insane to think about, but it's also something that's just like a lot of us in this time, especially like I'm 22, a lot of us now, if we were put in that time period, and living that lifestyle, like we're just going to work every day, like college, we were very frustrated with it, like we weren't, like we had our own house, but it's like, damn, this life sucks. You probably also would have been like myself probably would have been, because you're so emotional, vulnerable, you were so enraptured in this idea of living an ideal lifestyle, of being like spiritually enlightened, of being at one with your community, because everybody else is so shut off, probably would have been manipulated into being one of these cults. And it's something interesting to think about, because a lot of these people who are just regular everyday people, they just let their defenses down, they just let themselves be vulnerable, just like how some people do in a church setting, or how you do in therapy. And ultimately it resulted in their demise, especially with Jonestown, which really, really sucks. Like 900 people died, and the Wild Country had the like largest mass poisoning thing going on with them. And then I also found another one that I read about, the Davidians. They were in Waco, Texas, and it resulted in in a wildfire, and 75 people perishing along with the cult leader. So to reflect on that, basically, is just like, you can definitely put yourself in their shoes, because at one point in our lives, we all feel low. We all feel like, oh, we need to be a part of something greater, So, but some of us find, like go to therapy, we start painting, you go back to your relationships, you don't necessarily think, let me join a cult. But obviously, there are other like culty things. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but like besides religion, but there are things like not AA, but like things that feel like you're part of a community, like you're part of a family, but not a cult, you know. But yeah, that's just what I think about, and not what I think about, but like what the information that I was presented and wanted to research about for like these cult leaders, because it's just so sad and so sickening that the cult leader is in a position of power and he literally just abuses these people, and it's just disgusting to think about. But yeah, that's all I wanted to talk about today, and thank you guys for watching. And if you want to hear more about weird shit that I want to talk about, give me a follow in a comment. Thanks. Have a great day.